Well, there's a new move by a group of organizations to try and ensure that voters are able to know who is actually funding political parties. So there's a new law on political party funding. It means parties have to publish who gives them money on a regular basis. But, well, I suppose you could say throughout the history of democracy, perhaps throughout the history of politics, political parties have tried very hard to get around laws like this. Robyn Pasensie is a researcher at the organization My Vote Counts. Robyn, good afternoon to you. What are you trying to do here?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. Well, I think you partly said it already in your introduction, is that really what we're trying to do is make a point that ordinary South Africans, everyday people, are really interested in what kind of decisions their political parties are making on their behalf. So we understand in the kind of democratic setup that we have, our political parties enact political decisions on our behalf. So when we vote for them, there is an expectation that what they're going to do is work in our best interests. And what we want to see is that does in fact happen. So this move by civil society and activists and just campaigners in this party funding space has really been a long time coming. And initially the focus was, of course, trying to get legislation enacted in the first place. So now we have the Political Party Funding Act, which as of the 1st of April this year was officially enacted. Now that it's here, what we want to see is this act actually work for what it says it's going to. And we want to work alongside this as this collective that we've now put together. And we actually want to properly engender a kind of political culture that really seeks to put the interests of the public over private interests. So that's really the space for this coalition on party funding, where we see its work taking hold.
It's one thing to say political parties must give information to make it available. I mean, there's so many different ways to sort of, I suppose the word is fudge this, you know. You can do it in only paper. You have to actually go and wait outside someone's office to be allowed in to look at it. You can put it on a website, but put it in accounting speak. And I've got to tell you, I can only speak one language, and it's not accounting speak. Is it important to make it accessible? And I don't just mean to make the information available, I mean to make it understandable.
Absolutely. What you mentioned is actually one of the main reasons why we thought that this kind of collective was important, is that we know according to the Act that the IEC must publish the disclosures that political parties make to it. But our concern is that what you're just going to have is a large collection of raw data, essentially, that the public will be able to see. But that doesn't really make it accessible, doesn't really make it understandable. There's not really that kind of onus that's on them to do that. And so we see our work as, I think, coming in at that space specifically, because we don't just want it to be available, as just that we want it to be accessible. We want to be able to see the raw data of what these disclosures are, to be able to audit, essentially mine through this information to see who donors are, what their amounts are, make those kind of connections, correlations, summarize that information and make it more readily accessible to the public. So that if you're looking for information, if you're wanting to understand something about your political party and the decisions that they're making, then here is accurate information that you can access and look at and help you to kind of formulate your thinking, your opinions, and perhaps even the way you may vote.
I suppose what needs to happen is that the information all needs to be in one place and it needs to be packaged correctly. And that actually requires, I hate to say this, it requires that we find an accountant who's not boring. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. It requires that we need an accountant who can package information in an understandable way.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the questions that we are grappling with, and I think will continue to be a big question for the coalition, is that you need the expert knowledge to essentially do a forensic audit of this information. We need to rely on the experts with that kind of information. But then I think what we as the coalition are wanting to do is then take that information and provide that package that you are talking about, where it seems more exciting, where it seems like this is something that you can read and not perhaps become bored with the facts and figures that you see in front of you and lose interest when it comes to the point of seeing why these facts and figures matter for your everyday life.
This is, I mean, there's no way around this. This is bad news for political parties, right? So we know the ANC doesn't have enough money. The DA at one point took money from the Gupta family and then gave it back. I mean, that was a very long time ago. Other political parties, I'm sure, would say, if I had to ask them, no, Stephen, we don't have enough money, I'm sure. Whether they'll give me more detail, I don't know. So the temptation for any political party, and I mean, we could go further, political funding scandals happen in democracies around the world. I mean, you know, in the United States, their Supreme Court literally believes that money is speech. So what I'm saying is there's a strong temptation for parties to not tell the complete truth. And that means we actually have to force it out of them.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's why I think as a first step, the PPFA is important, because now this is a piece of legislation that's compelling you, that says we recognize that here's a problem. We've had people who have made this known in various sectors of civil society, My Vote Counts being one of those kind of organizations. But I think I mentioned it earlier, it's not just that. We need that legislation, but because of the kind of pushback that we have received over, I think, many years of being involved in this space, is that you also need a change in the thinking, in the political culture. And I think that's why the coalition thinks its work is also especially important. It's because while we want to work with the PPFA, we also need to be putting out moves, making a noise and pushing that kind of advocacy that says you need to change the way in which you think and approach the political decisions that you make, especially if legislation does not exist that mandates this kind of behavior. Or even if there is legislation that does speak to this, but it doesn't cover this part completely, then what you are going to do is, in fact, always work with a sort of public good in mind. And that is quite a hefty task. And this is why I think this coalition is a very long-term project. It's not just for the immediate, because we're going to have disclosures being made rather soon by the IEC in September. This is going quite far into the future, I think. It's a very long-term project.
It's also multi-layered, so we can talk about money to political parties, but there's money around factions and groups inside political parties. And I'm talking about internal political party leadership campaigns. And I mean, we know that at Nasrec, millions of rand, I mean, maybe R1 billion changed hands at the ANC's leadership conference in 2017. This takes us to the CR17 campaign, the court arguments there, all of that sort of going back to a high court now. There were more than one contestant, of course. Do you think we'll ever get to proper transparency on internal party fights at some point, or let me call them internal political leadership battles?
I mean, I think this is another important factor. I think it's important to mention that the PPFA and no other legislation kind of regulates the kind of intra-party funding that you're talking about, your funding of internal political campaigns. And I think this would probably be the next step that we would have to open up the sort of ambit of our focus. Because in the same way that we are saying that as a general rule of thumb, the funding that a political party receives will have real world consequences on the kind of decisions the political party takes as a whole, then I think we must also perhaps focus and look at what the internal struggles mean for that political party when they come together and make policy decisions, especially when that happens within a party that will become the governing party of South Africa. Because then that relates, those internal struggles have an effect on how they may govern should they win the national elections. And I think that will be an important focus for us to circle back to. But in terms of the PPFA as it stands now, that of course is not covered. So that will be an entirely new branch of kind of advocacy and perhaps even in future litigation, if that is necessary, on that space.
Robyn Pasensie, a researcher at My Vote Counts. I really appreciate the time today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.